Welcome to the third episode of Comic Secret History. My name is Mikey Crotty. Apologies for the delay in finalizing this episode, but the good news is that it's both the shortest of the three episodes to date and also the most contemporary, dealing primarily with events from just last year. As always, this episode follows the patterns of the others, presenting the actual facts around famous or infamous events in recent-ish comics history, in an effort to balance the overwhelmingly false narratives that perpetuate comics journalism and media. To my mind, this episode is the most shocking of the series so far. I'd like to thank the renowned British political cartoonist Steve Bell and Aaron Breitbart from the Simon Wiesenthal Center in New York for their very gracious assistance, expert analysis, and insight for the episode. This episode is respectfully dedicated to Eric Bennett, the Little Viking. Joe Bennett is a comic artist who worked on various Marvel, DC, and Image titles for almost 3 decades, without really making a name for himself. This all changed in early 2018 when he began penciling the new Immortal Hulk series for Marvel, written by Al Ewing. Bennett worked on almost all the issues of the series till its conclusion, with issue 50 in October 2021, over 3.5 years after the series had started. At this time, the series had become critically acclaimed, award-winning, and made comic superstars of the principal co-creators, writer Ewing and penciler Bennett. Though Bennett had been toiling away in almost obscurity for 3 decades, Ewing's star was very much on the rise over the last decade, and both creators were now in a position to reap the rewards of their acclaimed 3.5-year run on the title. But shortly after their run had been completed and their next high-profile projects announced, Ewing posted publicly, attacking Bennett for a reprehensible political cartoon, so reprehensible he couldn't even show or link to it in case folks made their own minds up about it, which Bennett had drawn in 2017, before they started working together. Ewing, while highlighting his own ignorance of the meaning, context, and people featured in the cartoon in his post, still implied that Bennett was anti-Semitic, and also insinuated that he had knowledge of other similarly reprehensible traits of Bennett, though he never explained or even supported this. However, Ewing did tellingly mention 2 charities that he would be donating to, by way of recompense for Bennett's secret reprehensible actions. An international charity which helps LGBT who face violence and oppression, and especially for the Brazilian Bennett, a rainforest sustainability charity, essentially letting folks think that these were the areas where Ewing also found Bennett to be reprehensible. We're going to focus on the facts again this episode, with the considered opinions of an expert in anti-Semitism and an outstanding political cartoonist, to see if a genuine anti-Semite was cancelled or not. So make yourselves comfortable and buckle up for a detailed, uncomfortable look at the events Al Ewing considered reprehensible. As stated previously, Joe Bennett is Brazilian. His real name is Benedito José Nascimento. He has lived in Brazil all his life and is descended from the native Mariora Indians. When Bennett was born, the country was a dictatorship, an authoritarian regime that did not end until 1985. Unsurprisingly, given the relatively recent stuttering emergence of democracy in the country, its political development has been rife with upsets, impeachments, scandals, and corruption, with police brutality and millions taking to the streets in protest prevalent in the last decade alone. And this is the environment where Bennett was raised and his family live. I feel it's important to note at this stage that I don't know Bennett. I have never communicated with him, and his obvious political leanings are definitely not my own. However, the purpose of this show is to unravel the facts around stories that are overwhelmingly accepted and promoted as true by the media, to reveal a truth that is completely contrary to what the audience have been told. And seeing as how those stories cost Bennett everything he'd worked 30 years for, the fact that we differ greatly politically did not dissuade my search for the truth. On the 2nd of September 2021, Bennett's co-creator on the Immortal Hulk, Al Ewing, published a public statement on his Twitter feed about a political cartoon Bennett drew 4 years earlier in 2017, which was regurgitated across comics and mainstream media and finished Bennett's career and destroyed his reputation. He was 52 years old, with a wife and 2 daughters. Though nothing in Ewing's statement reflected the actual context and details of the cartoon, it gave succor to internet rumors that Bennett was anti-Semitic, transphobic, and homophobic. The 2017 cartoon was just one of 4 events involving Bennett that may have been hinted at in Ewing's statement. It's hard to tell, given Ewing insinuated much and supported nothing. However, 4 separate events involving Bennett have been specifically cited or referenced by comics and mainstream media in his supposedly justifiable cancellation. 3 of these events, as described in the media, are false, and the other, while factually true, deserves context in the interest of fairness. And the tragic events preceding it are known only by a few folks, including Al Ewing. The incident that is real occurred on the 7th of November 2019, and this date is important. It involved Bennett publicly supporting an attack on a journalist on a Brazilian television show. Bennett did post in support of right-wing journalist Augusto Nunes, who slapped renowned American journalist and author Glenn Greenwald live on the Panicho television show. This has been widely reported subsequently as homophobia on Bennett's part, because Glenn Greenwald is gay. The slap came after Greenwald accused Nunes of attempting to remove his adopted sons from him. Nunes later blamed his violent response on being so appalled that he would be accused of attempting to take away anyone's child from their parents. Whether or not Nunes' excuses for his disgraceful act of violence are true, this is the incident that triggered Joe Bennett to react in support of Nunes on social media immediately afterwards, before deleting it and apologizing. I said earlier that only one of the accusations against Joe Bennett was true, but that in the interest of fairness it deserved context, not to in any way justify his ill-tempered post, but to possibly explain it. Bennett's infant son Eric died just weeks prior to the argument about sons being taken away from their fathers. Bennett has never referred to this to explain his actions, but anyone who has suffered a bereavement can empathize with the effect grief has on an otherwise reasonable person. We only know about Bennett's loss occurring in October 2019 as the November 20th, 2019 Immortal Hulk number 27 featured a tribute by Bennett to his son, suggesting the timing of his passing was just weeks before his Glenn Greenwald outburst. As part of the Immortal Hulk creative team, Al Ewing would have been well aware of Bennett's tragic loss and its actual date, as Bennett had to leave the comic for a few issues to deal with his family's loss. Bennett apologized unreservedly to Glenn Greenwald, his husband, and his children later the same day he attacked him online, without any reference to his own grief to justify himself. He also publicly acknowledged Glenn Greenwald as an excellent father and a good husband. He did this, in fact, 2 days before Greenwald even tweeted about the incident. Though Bennett never even referred to or alluded to Greenwald's sexuality in his offensive post, it was still subsequently described as homophobic in the comics media, and suggested as such in Ewing's damning post. Kate Kutersky of Multiversity Comics wrote, "Bennett is no stranger to controversy, having made several homophobic comments through the year." And Alexandra Isiek of AIPT Comics wrote, "Bennett's history on social issues has been disgraceful." Actually, Bennett's post describing a gay journalist as an excellent father and a good husband are the only comments he has ever made publicly concerning his views on homosexuality. The only other incident Ewing could be referring to in his public accusations and inference of intolerance in his recompensatory charitable donations is the widely propagated lie, thanks to Reddit and comics news sites, that Bennett is transphobic. This lie is based purely on the emoji Bennett used to respond to a bigoted poster's insulting criticism of his artwork. This is worth repeating. Joe Bennett was accused of transphobia because of the emoji he used to respond to a bigoted, insulting criticism of his artwork. In April 2020, a Reddit user posted a screen grab of a thread about Bennett's cover to the Immortal She-Hulk one. The poster, called Blue Exy, presented the screen snap of Bennett responding to a rude, critical post about his artwork with laughing emojis, and this was seen by Blue Exy as supporting the original bigoted poster's transphobic insulting criticisms. It should be noticed that Blue Exy, who started the whole Joe Bennett as a transphobic story, also claimed in the same Reddit post that Bennett has once again been caught posting anti-LGBT sentiment on social media, when in fact Bennett had and has never posted any LGBT sentiments on social media. Putting it simply, the post highlighted erroneously by Blue Exy insulted Bennett's artwork, his rendition of She-Hulk. For the anonymous poster and the media's reporting of it to have any validity, we have to accept that Bennett was liking or agreeing with a gross insult of his own abilities as an artist. For some reason, Blue Exy's utterly biased and factually inaccurate comments were seized upon by other anonymous users and the comics media. Some journalists, realizing that Bennett responding with a laughing emoji to a post insulting his work didn't really qualify as being transphobic, especially given the fact that he had been illustrating a transgender character, Dr. Charlene McGowan, sensitively and respectfully for years in the Immortal Hulk. So they lied and made Bennett more transphobic. Chelsea Steiner of the Mary Sue website wrote, "Just last year, Bennett liked transphobic comments on his public Instagram page." And again, AIPT Comics Alexandra Eichek wrote, "Moreover, Bennett, who has worked on a GLAAD award-winning series, has previously posted transphobic comments on social media." Neither of these examples of reporting were substantiated, as they weren't true. In fact, as obvious as it was to anyone without an agenda that Bennett was dismissing the original transphobic commenter's criticism of his abilities and his work by treating his comment as laughable, any investigation around Bennett's She-Hulk drawing and supposed transphobia would show that he actually only ever liked comments complimenting his rendition of She-Hulk on his Instagram, which is where he posted the image on 3 separate occasions, before and after Blue Exy's false accusations. So despite the best efforts of anonymous posters in the comics media, Bennett has never actually demonstrated any homophobic or transphobic attitudes, even at his lowest, most ill-tempered or grief-stricken ebb. If anything, he has publicly demonstrated the opposite. So it remains a mystery why Ewing would seek to insinuate as much in the public post that destroyed his colleague's career and reputation. Maybe things will become clearer when we take a look at the crux of the accusations by Ewing that ruined Bennett: his apparent anti-Semitism. The accusations of anti-Semitism given credence by Ewing's post have indelibly stained Bennett. Just Google his name and see the results. Even though the claims stem from 2 separate illustrations drawn almost 4 years apart, and Ewing's public condemnation purely focuses on the only one he personally isn't involved in, we should really, in fairness, just focus on the reprehensible anti-Semitism of Bennett's 2017 political Bolsonaro cartoon. The other anti-Semitic image, the infamous Jewry panel in 2020's Immortal Hulk issue 43, which a Marvel investigation found was genuinely an unfortunate mistake, and Ewing was culpable in, doesn't require analysis. That said, Bennett has never been treated fairly regarding accusations of being anti-something. So we'll investigate both supposed anti-Semitic images. Despite the 2017 Bolsonaro cartoon preceding the Immortal Hulk 43 Jewry panel by 4 years, it was actually the 2021 Jewry panel that first led to the attacks on Bennett, and the earlier Bolsonaro cartoon only became an issue subsequently, when it was used erroneously by Ewing and the media to bolster the accusations of anti-Semitism in the latter Jewry image, which again had been acknowledged by Marvel as a genuine mistake at this stage. The basis of the anti-Semitism accusations in the 2020 Immortal Hulk 43 are quite straightforward. But in the interest of expert opinion, I reached out to the Simon Wiesenthal Center in New York for their considered analysis, and senior researcher Aaron Breitbart was kind enough to assist and reviewed both images. Breitbart felt the 2020 Jewry panel was clearly anti-Semitic, given the prominence of the Star of David and the connotations of the Jewish involvement in the jewelry industry. Pretty damning against Bennett. But the fact is that Bennett's apology addressed all these issues as genuine mistakes. He was penciling a word in reverse, in English, which isn't his native language, and he misspelled it. And this is something he did throughout his run on the series. He even misspelled Cronenberg in the same panel. Also, Bennett's habit of creating logos or branding as tribute to film or comics creators is something that is also clearly evident throughout the Immortal Hulk series. In the very same issue of 43, he created venue branding for Al Milgrom, Stan Lee, and Jim Starlin. Where Bennett erred the most was, as identified by Aaron Breitbart, in his inclusion of the Star of David in the Cronenberg Jewelers branding. And Bennett blames his ignorance on this, and the facts support him. Brazil has one of the smallest Jewish populations in the world. Out of a population of approximately 214 million, there is estimated to be only 120,000 Jews in the country. The reality is that with such a low populace, the basic understanding of the average Brazilian of the Jewish culture, as well as the instances of anti-Semitism, are far, far less than you'd see in the population of, say, the US or Britain, where the folks whose job was to ensure Bennett's art was checked before publication lived. Bennett's full public apology and explanation was, "I've been including references to famous horror directors to pay respects to the genre throughout the series, and in Immortal Hulk 43 I included a nod to David Cronenberg. The misspellings on the window were an honest but terrible mistake. Since I was writing backwards, I accidentally spelled both of those words wrong. I have no excuse for how I depicted the Star of David. I failed to understand this troubling and offensive stereotype, and after listening to you all, I now understand my mistake. This was wrong, offensive, and hurtful in many ways. This is a mistake I must own, and I am sorry to everyone who I hurt by this. I am working with Marvel to correct this, and I am using this lesson to reflect on how I approach my stories and my work." Bennett's penciled artwork was actually seen by 5 other Marvel employees subsequent to his finishing it, and it was scrutinized by 4 other people. Al Ewing in Britain, who always did a review of the finished pencils, as he explained in a 2018 interview with Freak Sugar. "Joe pencils the issues and then I write a lettering script before it goes to Corey Petit, the letterer. That's when I'll tinker with the original dialogue. I'll move it around to fit the art, make sure it lines up with the expressions, and make alterations where they're needed. And then everything is reviewed again by the comics editors, Sarah Brunstad, Will Moss, Tom Brevoort in America, before being sent for printing. This fact, along with Bennett's explanation in his apology, is why Marvel accepted that it was an honest mistake, and recognized that they had played a role in it. Despite this subsequent level of scrutiny by folks far more versed in anti-Semitism than the Brazilian Bennett, he accepted full responsibility for his ignorant mistake, and never attempted to shift the blame to others in the process. Bennett's innocence wasn't helped by the comics media, who ignored the facts and depended on fake news to still attack him. Comics beat Joe Greenwald best epitomizes this reporting. "Whether you choose to believe Bennett's apology is sincere is up to you. Personally, I find it a little hard to swallow. If it had been just a misspelled word, I could believe it was an honest typo. But the inclusion of the Star of David is honestly baffling as anything other than anti-Semitic. Bennett's previous history of questionable behavior also doesn't make it any easier to believe this was a simple mistake on his part." Al Ewing never referred to this incident or his culpability in it, though we can infer, given the anti-Semitism it represented, albeit ignorantly and mistakenly, he may have been apportioning it all on Bennett when he wrote in his damning Bolsonaro cartoon post, "What those hurt by his behavior in the past should be willing to accept from him now." Again, I'm just guessing, as Ewing never substantiated anything, whether he was referring to Bennett's homophobic behavior of never actually posting or doing anything homophobic, or his transphobia, reflected not in how he drew a transgender character for years, but how he used a single emoji, as reported in a post by an anonymous Reddit user who lied about Bennett. Here is Al Ewing's public post in full that resulted in the cancellation of Joe Bennett. It's worth noting that Ewing waited until after their acclaimed almost 50-issue run on the Immortal Hulk had been completed. According to an interview with Bennett for the Brazilian newspaper Jornal da Cidade, Ewing never raised any concerns or issues with him, and he believed they were friends the whole time they worked together until Ewing emailed him on the same day he posted publicly, informing him he never wanted to work with him or hear from him again. Ewing posted this on the 2nd of September 2021, just weeks before the second anniversary of the death of Bennett's son, Eric. There's an image doing the rounds that Joe Bennett drew back in 2017. I won't link to it, but I have seen it, and it's reprehensible. If you've seen the image, you know what it is. An armoured swordsman, which I assume represents Bolsonaro given Joe's commentary, slaughtering tiny, scurrying people with buck teeth and ears of rats, and big noses. One of them is cosplaying Dracula. I'm assuming these are political enemies of some kind, but even if not, the tropes are apparent. Human beings as vermin being exterminated. Even if it's no longer up, that it was drawn in the first place, signed, and so proudly displayed by Joe speaks volumes. This isn't the first issue with Joe that I've been made aware of. I've spoken behind the scenes. But that's no comfort to people at the sharp end of this kind of brutal propaganda. My lack of public visibility on this has let people down, and I apologize. In the interest of adding some material action to that apology, I've made donations to Rainbow Railroad and the Rainforest Trust. I understand if that feels like an empty or insufficient gesture for those reading this. Immortal Hulk is done, but I won't be working with Joe again. If people choose not to pick up my work with any artists in the future on the basis of my handling of this, I understand and accept that. If I've lost your trust, that's on me. I can't speak for Joe on this. He can speak for himself. But I will say that it's not up to him or me what those hurt by his behavior in the past should be willing to accept from him now. He's made his bed. With all this said, I'm probably going to remain off Twitter myself for now and not read or reply to mentions for a while. Again, if that feels insufficient, I understand. Thank you for reading. Unsurprisingly, comics media picked up and amplified Ewing's post, attaching it directly as Ewing intended based on his language onto Bennett's previous accidental anti-Semitic imagery, ignoring Ewing's own responsibility in that and Marvel's acceptance of Bennett's explanation and apology. Comicosity editor Matt Santori posted of Bennett, "It's garbage, he's garbage, and any comic company continuing to employ him is garbage." Bleeding Cool's Rich Johnson, who also describes himself as a political cartoonist, invented additional reprehensible cartoons by Bennett. A number of Bennett's political cartoons being widely shared last week. CBR's Tim Adams wrote accusing Bennett of posting an anti-Semitic image on social media. Sci-Fi.com's Mike Avia wrote, "Bolsonaro's foes are shown having large noses and buck teeth, images that some people, including this writer, saw as being anti-Semitic." And Comic Beat's Joe Greenwald, who dislikes the facts as much as he dislikes Bennett, contributed, "Bennett slipped anti-Semitic imagery into an issue of Immortal Hulk. Why the controversy over the initial anti-Semitic imagery was not enough to get Marvel to cut ties with Bennett is unclear." The only thing is, Bennett's so-called anti-Semitic Bolsonaro cartoon didn't feature any Jewish people. Every single one of the rodent-like characters is a recognizable caricature of a specific non-Jewish Brazilian politician. Even without the full context, Aaron Breitbart of the Simon Wiesenthal Center didn't consider the Bolsonaro cartoon as anti-Semitic as the comics media. Describing its anti-Semitism as debatable, Breitbart considered the line in Ewing's public attack, "and big noses," and commented, "The noses of the individuals depicted are reminiscent of long-time stereotypical depictions of Jews, but one could argue this was not Bennett's intention." And Breitbart is correct. A modicum of research not afforded the cartoon by Ewing or any of the media who reported on it reveals that all 6 rodent-like caricatures are recognizable representations of Christian Brazilian politicians who had either been arrested or were under investigation for corruption and abuse of power. In fact, all 6 are instantly recognizable to Brazilians, who Bennett intended it for, only posting it on his personal social media and in Portuguese. Presented as anti-Semitic Jewish stereotypes by Ewing, who wrote, "I'm assuming these are political enemies of some kind, but even if not, the tropes are apparent." The six are actually, from left to right, Antonio Palocci, former finance minister and chief of staff, arrested in 2016 and sentenced to 12 years in jail in 2017 for his part in the infamous car wash scandal. Dilma Rousseff, suspended as president and impeached in 2016 over her role in Operation Car Wash. On the 13th of March 2016, 3.5 million Brazilians took to the streets to call for her impeachment. Eduardo Cunha, former Speaker of the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies, suspended due to allegations of him intimidating and obstructing investigations, then arrested in 2016 after taking $40 million in bribes, sentenced in 2017 to 15 years in jail for corruption, tax evasion, and money laundering connected to the car wash scandal. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, former president, convicted of money laundering and corruption and jailed for 580 days in 2018. Senator Aécio Neves, popular anti-Bolsonaro politician, connected to but never convicted as part of the car wash scandal. Notable standouts in his corrupt history include a colleague who was arrested with 450 kilos of cocaine when he landed at Neves' private family airport, and his most vocal critic, a police officer and member of Bolsonaro's political party, Lucas Arcanjo, was found dead in 2016 after publicly accusing Neves of drug trafficking and murder. Next up is Michael Temer, former president, charged in 2017 with accepting bribes and arrested in 2019 as part of Operation Car Wash. Temer was nicknamed Dracula by some of the Brazilian press and regularly featured in political cartoons as a vampire. This was not an invention by Bennett. Operation Car Wash comes up a lot in Brazilian politics. It was a massive investigation into political corruption, spanning decades, involving bribery and the awarding of contracts and licenses to foreign-controlled energy conglomerates to strip the country of its natural assets. Ironically, all of the six rodent-like figures Ewing felt so sorry for he donated to the Rainforest Sustainable Charities were involved in facilitating the exploitation and destruction of Brazil's natural resources for massive bribes, and several of them were actually actively anti-LGBT while in power. These are the actual folks who've been presented without question as anti-Semitic tropes by Ewing and his supporters in the comics media. Bennett drew the cartoon shortly after and as a reaction to the stabbing of his candidate of choice, Bolsonaro, in 2017, when it was believed that an agent of the fine folks featured previously was responsible. At the time Bennett drew the piece, the two decapitated figures were the only ones who had actually been imprisoned for their crimes and were no longer still in a position of power. So without the anti-Semitic smears, is this Brazilian political cartoon still reprehensible enough to justify the public ending of Bennett's career and reputation? According to one of Britain's greatest political cartoonists, the answer is both yes and no, and the different reactions may all be cultural. Steve Bell has been a critically acclaimed award-winning political cartoonist for over 4 decades and has been awarded the accolade of Cartoonist of the Year multiple times. He is probably the most qualified expert to give a non-Brazilian political cartoonist perspective on Bennett's Bolsonaro cartoon. And for the most part, he actually agrees with Ewing's reaction, writing, "Whether or not any of the characters are Jewish or not, and whether the cartoon is anti-Semitic or not, in this instance is entirely irrelevant. The overriding trope is clearly human beings as vermin being exterminated, and there is nothing accidental about it." Bell's qualified insight continues. "I have often depicted people I oppose as all kinds of vermin, shithouse rats, ticks, creepy spider monsters, but context is everything here, and I am always careful never to suggest extermination as any kind of positive course of action." While I can't disagree with anything Bell says, and his own resume renders his opinion almost infallible, his perspective, like Ewing's, is from a British point of view, and as he himself notes, context is everything here. The fact is, in Brazilian media and culture, Corrupt politicians and people of power are regularly depicted as rodents or rodent-like. What we in the Western world see as reprehensible or abhorrent is not viewed in the same way in different parts of the world or in different cultures, and it is in this context, as Bell recognizes, that a Brazilian artist's political cartoon about Brazilian politics presented to a Brazilian audience should properly and fairly be viewed. You've been looking at a combination of award-winning political cartoons from Brazil and elsewhere, featuring vermin and rodents, some involving extermination. But here's some pics of the first place winning float in the Rio de Janeiro 2018 festival from the Beija-Flor Samba School, which would have been designed in 2017 around the same time as Bennett drew his Bolsonaro cartoon. It features corrupt political figures as rats and other rodents. One of them is cosplaying Dracula. They're laundering money. Others, represented as wolves, are holding aloft the heads of the sheep they're supposed to watch over, while a giant rat tows a mock favela where cartels gun down its residents. Is this reprehensible too? Probably to Western political sensibilities, but a Brazilian audience celebrated it. It won the public vote that year. And this is how important context is, both chronologically and culturally. Millions of ordinary Brazilians took their frustration and anger to the streets in mass protest against the same politicians Bennett featured. Bennett used his art to condemn those he and the majority of the country saw as selling them out. One thing for a person to publicly criticize another's work, but when it's specifically over the politics and identity and culture of just one of the parties, and one person's view results in the cancellation of the other, as in the case of Ewing and Bennett, then it smacks of xenophobia. And that's without even acknowledging that Ewing is a white Briton and Bennett a brown Brazilian. Given Bennett was cleared of intentional anti-Semitism by a Marvel Comics investigation, and that there isn't a single shred of evidence to support the false accusations of homophobia or transphobia against him, it seems clear that the Bolsonaro cartoon and Ewing's very public reaction to it was the reason Marvel removed him from his already announced follow-up project and announced that they were never going to work with him again. I can't see anything other than the reality is that Marvel fired a Brazilian artist for drawing a Brazilian cartoon about Brazilian politics that an Englishman didn't like. Even though Steve Bell has the same reaction as Ewing, he recognizes and acknowledges the importance of context, something no one who participated in the destruction of a father and a husband's career and reputation did. And tellingly, with over 40 years' experience at the highest levels of political cartooning, Steve Bell's opinion differs very greatly from Ewing's over the consequence of his post in his cartoon. And Steve Bell's observation sums up something that everyone involved in the cancellation of Joe Bennett should have considered, and seems the perfect way to end this episode. Bell wrote, "I am sorry if Joe Bennett, who is clearly a talented artist, has lost his job, seemingly as a result of this cartoon, and anyone should think very long and hard before calling for the dismissal of any colleague, simply because they happen to profoundly disagree with their political opinions. You never know what is going to come back to bite you in the arse." Thanks a million for listening, everyone. If you've appreciated this episode, don't worry about subscribing or liking or anything like that. Just if you can spread the word, share it with friends and colleagues.